Hello, everyone. Welcome to Untold History, the channel where we explore little-known but crucial chapters of world history. Today we delve into a little-mentioned episode in Peruvian history that marked a symbolic struggle for indigenous freedom in the 18th century, the rebellion of Juan Santos Atahualpa. This indigenous leader, who proclaimed himself a descendant of the Incas, led an uprising in the central jungle of Peru against Spanish rule. This event ignited a spark of resistance and became an emblem of the struggle for indigenous identity and autonomy in an era of colonial oppression. To understand this rebellion, we must first understand the colonial context of Peru at that time. In the 18th century, life in the Viceroyalty of Peru was extremely difficult for indigenous peoples. Power was concentrated in the hands of the Spanish elite, and the indigenous people were subject to a system of exploitation that included forced labor and heavy tribute. The ancestral lands of the native peoples had become the property of Spanish settlers, while the indigenous peoples were forced to work in mines and plantations under harsh conditions. This systematic oppression generated deep resentment among indigenous communities, who dreamed of liberation from colonial domination. Juan Santos Atahualpa emerges in this scenario as a charismatic and visionary leader. He claimed to be a direct descendant of the last Inca emperor, Atahualpa, and used this ancestry to inspire indigenous peoples. Atahualpa had spent years in contact with various communities in the jungle and closely observed the injustices to which the indigenous people were subjected. On this basis, he began to devise a rebellion that would aim to restore indigenous autonomy and expel the Spanish from Peruvian territory. The figure of Juan Santos Atahualpa acquired an almost mythical character. In him one saw the hope of an Inca rebirth, a promise of dignity and justice for the subject peoples. In 1742, Juan Santos Atahualpa launched his resistance movement in the central jungle region of Peru, an area difficult for Spanish settlers to access. His plan was bold and strategic. By establishing his stronghold in the jungle region, he used the terrain and his knowledge to hinder the advance of the Spanish troops. From the beginning, Atahualpa attracted diverse Amazonian and Andean indigenous communities and quickly cemented an alliance with other local leaders. This uprising was characterized by its guerrilla strategy, with ambush tactics and rapid movements that disconcerted the colonial forces. In his campaign, Atahualpa sought to recover indigenous lands and restore respect for the cultural and spiritual traditions of his people. Unlike other indigenous rebellions in the Viceroyalty, Juan Santos Atahualpa's rebellion not only had a military component, but also sought to revive indigenous cultural identity. Atahualpa proclaimed the elimination of the symbols of Spanish domination, such as Christianity, and encouraged a return to ancestral beliefs. In his speeches, Atahualpa is said to have called on his followers to free themselves from the spiritual slavery imposed by the missionaries and to recover their native religion. Juan Santos Atahualpa's rebellion was not only a struggle for land and political freedom, but also an attempt to preserve and revive indigenous culture, which had been suppressed since the Spanish conquest. As the rebellion grew stronger, the colonists and the viceregal government began to worry. Initial attempts to quell the rebellion failed, and Spanish authorities found that going deep into the jungle was an almost impossible task. The troops sent by the Viceroyalty faced not only indigenous resistance, but also the difficult conditions of the jungle. The presence of tropical diseases and the lack of supplies for a prolonged campaign hampered military operations in the area. Atahualpa and his followers took advantage of this knowledge of the terrain to carry out surprise attacks and retreat to their hideouts in the jungle, highlighting the fragility of colonial power in those regions. In addition to his military prowess, Atahualpa also managed to unite various ethnic groups that had traditionally been in conflict. Under his leadership, Amazonian and Andean peoples who rarely collaborated with each other came together in a common cause: the expulsion of the settlers. This alliance showed unprecedented unity among Peru's diverse indigenous communities and elevated the rebellion to a level that transcended regional divisions. The figure of Atahualpa became a symbol of hope, unifying indigenous peoples around the vision of a Peru without Spanish domination. As time went by, Atahualpa's rebellion began to show its effects. In several regions of the jungle, the Spanish had to retreat and abandon their missionary settlements. The Jesuit missions, which until then had evangelized and dominated these areas, were attacked, and many were completely deserted. However, although Atahualpa managed to liberate several areas of the central jungle and create a kind of free territory, the reality is that his movement could not spread to the rest of the country. The indigenous communities of the highlands, who also suffered from colonial oppression, did not join the movement en masse, in part due to the great geographical distance and limited communication between regions. The viceregal government tried to negotiate with Atahualpa, but their efforts were unsuccessful. The settlers were forced to accept that some areas of the jungle were out of their control and that Atahualpa and his followers remained steadfast in their resistance. Despite not achieving a total victory, Juan Santos Atahualpa's rebellion represented a symbolic challenge to Spanish rule and maintained the spirit of resistance among indigenous communities. Although Atahualpa mysteriously disappeared around 1756, his figure continued to be an inspiration to the indigenous peoples, who kept alive the memory of their leader and the struggle for freedom. In the long term, the rebellion of Juan Santos Atahualpa left a deep mark on Peruvian history and on the memory of indigenous peoples. This uprising represented one of the first and most successful indigenous resistances against colonial rule in Peru. Years later, other rebellions, such as that of Tupac Amaru II, would take up the ideal of freedom and justice that Atahualpa had defended. The figure of Juan Santos Atahualpa continues to be remembered as a precursor in the struggle for indigenous autonomy and the preservation of cultural identity. Although the rebellion did not result in independence, the resistance of Atahualpa and his people in the jungle left a clear message. The indigenous peoples of Peru were not willing to accept their subjugation. Their movement demonstrated that the identity and dignity of the native communities were still alive and unwavering in the face of colonial oppression. Today, the memory of Juan Santos Atahualpa continues to be a symbol of resistance, a reminder that the original peoples of Latin America fought and continue to fight for their right to be heard and respected. We hope that this story of Juan Santos Atahualpa's rebellion has given you a new perspective on Peru's history and indigenous resistance. If you liked the episode and want to continue discovering revealing chapters of the story, don't forget to subscribe, activate the bell, and leave us your comments. We'd love to hear what other historical topics you'd like to explore here on Untold History. Until next time.